I'm Robert.
And I'm Evelyn.
And this is Tolkien About It.
And we are very excited because while we only have 3 main episodes left talking about Lord of the Rings, we can officially make our announcement about our next upcoming discussions about The Hobbit. So, as we've mentioned before, The Hobbit is the only work of Tolkien I have actually read before. So, I know what happens. However, there are 2 voices that you have heard on this podcast before who have not read the Hobbit books yet. And they are going to be joining
And yet
us.
their husbands still married them.
Who have also been on the podcast. So we're very excited to announce that Evelyn, Michael Rose, and Amy that have been on movie episodes talking about Lord of the Rings, whose both of their husbands are huge diehard Tolkien fans and will also kind of guest star a little bit later, because they both said that they need to discuss the Hobbit movies. So excited for what that's going to be like. But yeah, neither of them have read the Hobbit books before, and we are really excited to have them as our host for all of the Hobbit discussions as well, being that voice of reading it for the first time. Because that was the whole point of this podcast, is I had never read Lord of the Rings before, and I still haven't read other Tolkien works either, except for Beowulf, which we did the bonus episodes on, which can you really consider it? It was just really his translation. But it was interesting. So we're really excited to have them. Our group chat, I made a little teaser on our social medias. We're called the Shire Adventuring Company. Is our text chain that we have going on, getting everything ready. So we're going to be starting to record those soon. That way they can be ready and out for you guys as soon as we're done wrapping up all things Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
That being said, I know we've had me leading a lot of the podcasts the last couple times in a row. Usually we switch off, but I'm leading this one again today because for the one coming out next is one that I'm really excited for Dad to do. So today we're going to be talking about how Lord of the Rings and in extension Tolkien completely, like, he revolutionized and influenced literature. And then the next episode is going to be the surprising influence of Lord of the Rings on music and music culture, which is something that I know you are really into and really love. So Dad's going to be doing that one. And then our last one is we're really excited to look at several different parodies of Lord of the Rings. So that'll also be fun to kind of talk about, because I mean, it's, you've made it when you get a parody, like you get popular parodies of it.
Right.
Yeah. So we're going to be looking at we're not going to be looking at all of them because there are a lot, but the 3 that we're going to be looking at is we're going to be doing Bender's Game, which is one of the Futurama movies, which is influenced by both D&D and Lord of the Rings.
But D&D was influenced by Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. And then we're going to be doing the South Park Lord of the Rings episode, and we're going to make that as clean as we possibly can talking about it.
So we're not going to talk about it.
Because again, you've made it if South Park parodies you. And then finally, we are going to talk about The Lord of the Beans, the VeggieTales movie, which I think is just really interesting.
It's so smart.
It's really smart. And the thing is, I don't know if we still, like, we probably don't have it anymore, but
Probably on VHS.
Well, I remember this was the first DVD we got, because with Dad being a pastor, we were sent like advanced copies of different VeggieTales stuff.
I was an ambassador.
And I vividly remember us getting the advanced copy and then seeing the final release, and they had changed a few things. And it was like the first time, like, in like my consciousness about like, oh, you're allowed to fix things that weren't right in media. And honestly, it did influence me loving film and like knowing like the production leading up to it. I don't know, but
Okay, so
that just stayed with me
we
my
are
whole
not,
life.
people are not allowed to fix stuff in media. They can go from beta to what's actually released. But when
True.
you
I
but
yeah.
when you do stuff like actually change what the FBI agents are holding in their hands in ET, or whether or not Han Solo shot first. And technically, Han Solo did not.
Han shot first.
Technically, Han did not shoot first. He's the only one to shoot.
That is true. Yeah. That's a really valid point, honestly. Yeah. But yeah, I guess it's revisions versus changes. I don't know.
Yeah.
All I know is it was very formidable to me in my like brain space as a kid. So anyway, let's talk about
Oh,
literature.
wait until you have you watched all 5,000 versions of Blade Runner?
No,
There are actually 6 versions.
I am aware. Um, and I am consciously deciding I don't want to go down that rabbit hole at this time.
Okay.
So literature. Um, so Tolkien, just getting right into it, he is considered the father of fantasy. We've talked about this before at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings episodes, where Tolkien and his friends in the Inklings group, they basically decided to write the fantasy they wanted to see in the world. They weren't satisfied with the type of fantasy that was out there. They had ideas of their own of what they wanted to read. So they're like, all right, let's go ahead and just do it. And that's pretty much exactly what Tolkien did. And I don't, I, I truly wish that even now, like, just to ask Tolkien or even like Christopher, now that he's passed, like just continuing to have them around just to get their ideas about how much it truly influenced and changed the literary world, especially within the context of fantasy literature. Because one of the random Tolkien facts that I know is that he had personal beef with the Beatles because he was a neighbor and thought they were too loud. And it's like, and I don't know, like knowing Tolkien and the Beatles were in the same place at the same time kind of messes with
I
my
have
mind a
never
little bit.
heard of that before.
I'm gonna have to find it. But yeah, apparently they were neighbors and they
That
were really loud.
sounds like mythology to me.
I'm gonna have to look up and find that exactly. But still, like knowing that he was around at the same time as the Beatles, so he just it came about and became so popular about 5 to 10 years after it was originally published. And just to see what it has done and all of the influences, I'm just so curious what Tolkien would think of that
Well,
now. Like even with the movies that have come out changing film industry.
that one of the things that I find interesting is that it was so much more popular in the United States than Great Britain that a university in the United States has his archives.
Yes. Yeah, we just learned that a couple days ago actually.
Well, I always knew it, but I always thought it was
Oh,
weird.
yeah. But yeah, let's get into why. So,
Oh, okay, well, first I want to mention something really fast.
okay.
Talking about literature influences. So there's a series of books called The Chronicles of the Imaginarium Geographia by James A. Owen. The first of those books, Here There Be Dragons. This is a fantasy book written about those inklings and their associates where they got their ideas
Mm.
by going they got these ideas because they got sucked into this imaginary world.
Oh yeah, they're absolutely time travelers.
Well, no, it's not time.
Oh, space.
It's not space.
Dimensions?
Dimensions.
Dimensions. Okay.
And so I love that. I love that series of books. So
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Um, with that. Well, that's like in our last episode, I finally connected the dots and I have determined that Tolkien is a descendant of Bilbo Baggins. So, no, Sam. He's a descendant of Sam. That's what it was. If you want to hear that rabbit hole, definitely listen to our last episode because there's some compelling evidence that I put together with that. But anyway, back to Lord of the Rings. So, Lord of the Rings is regarded as the archetypal work for high and epic fantasy. And while there were epics and the concept of writing those stories had definitely been around before Tolkien, the popularity and success of Lord of the Rings did twofold things where it not only helped popularize older books because people wanted to read other older stories like that, but then publishers would go out and look for similar newer stories and publish them as well. So, Lord of the Rings found a massive amount of success in the US, like we said, actually in the 60s, due to the counterculture interest in sword and sorcery. And when it became so successful and popular, publishers were just looking for all of these older books that were written to republish for this new group of people. And then you were saying that you even have like some old stuff from the 60s from that like like counterculture
Right.
scene.
Yeah. So Lord of the Rings and to a lesser, but almost as big, The Hobbit really started turning people's minds as far as being able to look beyond reality and what can the future look like. And so there was a whole college movement sometime in the 60s where it was the motto was Frodo lives.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere along the lines, mom found a a round pen,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that says Frodo lives. And it's from
Time
that
period, yeah.
time period. And that was one of the things that I have been given by family members that I really cherish. And
Mm-hmm.
and it's not, I'm sure she didn't even spend more than $5-6 for it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's
But the meaning behind it.
the meaning behind it is just
Yeah, it's
so
so
cool.
cool. Because you were a kid in the 60s and a teenager in the 70s, and you were really into like all of this sword and sorcery stuff. Do you
I actually didn't get into the sword and sorcery stuff until high school.
okay. Well, I was gonna ask, do you remember like seeing the rise of it, like seeing more and more stuff out there? Do you have any recollection of it, or was it just like when it came on your radar, you were just in?
Right. So when I first started avidly reading, um, Dad had the full set of the Ian Fleming's paperback James Bonds,
Hmm.
and I read those in order probably two or three times.
Hmm.
And then I later on, and I was interested in watching these fantasy slash sci-fi movies late on Friday nights.
Okay, yeah, because Grandpa is still a big reader,
Yeah,
but he tends to go towards like westerns and mysteries.
right. Yeah, but he's the one that got me into
I guess James Bond,
James Bond and those
those kind of thrillers.
the thrillers, the mystery
The
thrillers,
okay.
and uh, and so forth. I never could get into the westerns. They all kind of seem they're either a westernized version of another genre
Hmm.
or they're repetitive of every other western book ever written.
Gotcha. I know, like, growing up watching Westerns with Grandpa, some of them are fun, but I tend to find them very derivative of each other. And I know it's controversial, but I can't stand John Wayne. And as a film student, I had to watch so many John Wayne films. And
Technically, they're not John Wayne films. They're John Ford films that John Wayne happened to be in. John Ford is the one that created those films and made those films iconic.
all I know is we had to watch Stagecoach twice and The Searchers twice for different classes. And just not for me. I'm not going to trash them on this podcast, but believe me, when I'm at home, I definitely trash them. But we're gonna skip that part.
All right,
Though,
sidebar.
oh, I was gonna say real fast though, Firefly is just fantastic, mixing that sci-fi with the western. I think they do a really
There's a
great job of
Sean
it.
Connery movie called Outlander,
Mm-hmm.
and it's basically cowboy sheriff in space.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it really is.
Okay.
But one of my most favorite John Wayne movies is not a Western.
Okay.
It's called The Quiet One.
Mm-hmm.
And John Wayne is an ex-American boxer who we find out later killed somebody in the ring. So he went back to his grandparents' homeland in Ireland,
Mm-hmm.
and the movie ensues.
Interesting. Okay.
And it was mostly all because John Ford wanted to make a movie about Ireland in Ireland.
Okay. Sure. Why not?
So my second favorite movie of all time. My first favorite movie of all time is very influenced by Tolkien and that gang of writers.
Okay.
The Princess Bride.
Yes. I was thinking that's what you were gonna say. Yeah, it's great movie. Great movie.
The Princess, and it's even a better book. It's even a better book. If you've not read the book, read it.
Yeah, the book is incredible. But yeah, that's exactly what it was. Like it found success in the 60s and to this day,
When you say it, you should say,
Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry.
or
So,
else they're going to think
it. Uh
either it, the book, or it being the last topic we were talking about, which was Princess Bride.
True. So Lord of the Rings has been regarded by many groups as being both the best book of the 20th century as well as the most important book of the 20th century. Stuff that he did just completely revolutionized everything because you have him making maps and geographies and political landscapes, and the popularity of that replaced the old popularity of dream worlds where someone is sucked into a dream world. I'm just going to give the Wizard of Oz as an easy example. And then Tolkien's work on fairy stories was also a formative work on fantasy criticism as well. So he revolutionized the fantasy genre, but as well as criticism of the genre.
Okay. When you talk about Wizard of Oz, in the context you talked about, you're talking about the movie.
Yes.
The book is a commentary on America at the time it was written.
I am aware. I read them.
Yeah.
I read them, but yes, I'm talking about the more popular movie.
What? No. Read the book.
Yeah, definitely read the book. And at the time, the books lost popularity. But they're so good. Definitely read them. They're very interesting.
And then read them before you read the book. Wicked, if you've never read the book that the musical comes from.
Which is also absolutely incredible. But yeah, it does take more from the Wizard of Oz books than it does from the Wizard of Oz movie, which I think is really interesting as well. But to continue on from all these rabbit holes, So during the time of this,
No, we're giving them a reading list.
true. Speaking of, during this time in the 60s, we have the start in the 60s as well of the Earth Sea series. And
Read the books.
yes, and we're giving you a lot of books here to read, guys. And so the author, she includes Tolkien as an influence in her writing style. And these books became incredibly popular as well in the 60s, which further influenced this fantasy genre. And we also see, prior to the popularity of all these books in the 60s, most fantasy stories were short stories that were published in magazines. But now that all of these larger books and novels were becoming very popular, publishers replaced the magazines essentially with novels that had a mass market appeal.
So also, um, all the Sherlock Holmes stories were originally serialized in magazines
Mm-hmm.
before they were put in book form too. I just want to mention that.
Okay. All right. So we get those types of inspirations that um in the 60s it really helped popularize it, and then we have the Sword of Shannara and the Chronicles of Thomas Convent, who were
Read the
also read the
books.
books, and they came about in the late 70s and early 80s. And again, they were directly inspired by Tolkien, and it continued this rise of fantasy popularity and interest in the fantasy genre. And that's when we start to see those like TV and movie adaptations coming out, where it kind of gets into a wider range of pop culture, essentially. And fast forward to today, most people have heard of Game of Thrones and The Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, who himself was directly influenced, and his works have now dramatically influenced fantasy now in the 21st century.
Right.
So it's becoming a legacy at this point. His like these it like these series are just continuing to inspire each other. But you also have The Sword of Shannara, mentioned before, by Terry Brooks in 1977, and then Aragon much later by Christopher Palin. I cannot pronounce his last name, so I'm sorry if it's wrong, but it's Polo Palini. I'm gonna go with Palini. I apologize if I'm butchering it. But their works were directly influenced by Tolkien, and both of those works had a massive success. We're gonna forget about the Aragorn movie. But a majority of their criticism was being too much like Tolkien and being almost derivative of Tolkien. And that's something that we start to see as well, is we see like this double-edged sword of people and authors are incredibly inspired by Tolkien, but sometimes their works are too much like Tolkien, and the comparison is there.
But to be fair, and we'll talk about it later in this podcast, but to be fair, a lot of the criticism comes from people who don't understand about um, heroes' journeys.
Yeah, that I will agree with that. And we're going to touch that in just a second. I had one more thing before we were actually going to get that. So, the only other thing that I was going to mention is that a lot of these books that were inspired by Tolkien are now inspiring other writers. Even Harry Potter, which we'll mention a little bit more about the influences on Harry Potter, but that work has also greatly influenced pop culture, essentially, with interest in fantasy. But then you also have authors like Philip Pullman, who wrote his Dark Materials, where he and other authors intentionally wrote stories with a rejection of Tolkien's themes and styles. Where
And that's why don't read the book.
actually his Dark Materials is really good.
I don't like them.
Oh, I like them. And the show, I think it was on HBO. I can't remember, but the show was good too. But anyway, some authors just did not like Tolkien's style, his themes, his works. And so their conscious decision of making books that and works that are totally different from Tolkien can be argued in itself was inspired by Tolkien.
Okay.
In a roundabout way, which for Philip Pullman especially would actually probably piss him off if he heard me say that, but I stand by it. But now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the distinctive features for the that Tolkien did that you see in more modern fantasies that have been inspired. But before that, we have a really interesting thing to talk about that involves the distinct features. So this was something that Dad was researching, and it was something where we thought we knew it, but as we researched it, we found out we didn't know it. But it's kind of
No, we didn't know it well.
We didn't know it well, and as we researched it, it was just really interesting. So you're going to talk about the hero's journey.
Okay.
Yeah. So first of all, the hero's journey, like who did that?
Okay, so Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he proposes that all hero stories follow a similar pattern. It doesn't matter what part of the world that story comes from. Now, I first learned about this idea as what was at the time for me was called the mega myth. Because the mega myth can be found in all the major religions because it's something that's practically ingrained in us. Because we all want to reach our full. So there are 12 stages of the hero's journey, which is divided into 3 acts.
Well, before we start that, the reason that we were looking at it in the first place is because we knew it was written around the same time that Lord of the Rings was written. And we were curious about
It's actually written after The Hobbit was written, and it was published before Lord of the Rings was published, but they were basically works around the same time.
Yeah, they were both working on these projects and ideas at the same time. And according to the official website of the research foundation of, oh my gosh, what was his name again?
Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, so his website actually has a whole section where they have done extensive research, and as far as they are aware, they never spoke, Tolkien and him never spoke at this time. So that's what's so interesting is that Tolkien had no idea about this theory, but as Dad's going to talk about, like, his story is like almost a perfect example of it.
Right.
And it's constantly, and I remember it being used in my literary classes in high school and college as like a perfect example of it.
Yes. So there are 12 stages of the hero's journey, and it's divided into 3 acts. Separation, supreme ordeal, and unification. Now, this whole idea has become so popular that for some screenwriting classes talks about this method.
Yes. In the one screenwriting class I had to take, it we did go over this. And you see it not only in fantasy genre, but you see it in sci-fi, you see it in like modern stuff. You see it all over the place now.
So where we start with it is we begin in the ordinary world. So the world that we know of. And that's what we have from the beginning. And it can be even related to what we call home, from where we are called to adventure from home. And we usually hit our first conflict, which we're called to adventure, but there is a refusal of the call for one reason or another.
Right.
Which can take place in many ways, like I said.
Mhm.
Then there is meeting the mentor or getting supernatural aid.
Mhm.
Next comes the first threshold into the unknown, which is the beginning of transformation.
So we see Frodo. No, none of that. Okay, I'll let you keep talking.
After I go through the list, I will
Oh, give the example. Okay,
examples.
sure.
Okay. So there is the meeting the mentor or getting supernatural aid. So next is crossing to the first threshold into the unknown, which we also known as the beginning of transformation. Then the second act begins with test, allies, and enemies. It's where these three are defined for us, either in the story or that we define them for ourselves,
Mhm.
in simple terms or very specific terms. Now, once we think we know all these previous stages, we then have our ordeals that takes us from trials and failures. Uh, they in turn provide growth or new skills, also known as seizing the reward.
Mhm.
We often have the road back home, but it's the beginning, it's the very beginning of the road back home. There is death and rebirth, or what's also known as resurrection and atonement. This stage can also be seen as a revelation that causes some change the hero makes, which allows atonement.
Mhm.
We receive some type of gift, and that can be physically, mentally, or spiritually. When we turn back and arrive back into the normal world, the hero has been changed. And there's also usually an idea of freedom within that um, change. Now, Campbell did not necessarily see this as a one and done because the possibility is that there could be more cycles.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, that the cycle can continue.
continue. Now, looking at Lord of the Rings, it seems to me that all the members of the Fellowship go through these stages in some fashion,
Right.
most of it in separate ways at separate times.
And that was something that we were discussing off mic is that a lot of times in fantasy, and this isn't a bad thing, but a lot of times in fantasy, you really only have that one hero's journey. But that's what makes The Lord of the Rings so fascinating, is because the fellowship, you really do see that hero's journey
Right.
for all of them.
Yeah. So, like I said, looking at Lord of the Rings, each of them kind of go through all these stages. So, the stage, ordinary world. You think about Frodo and the hobbits. They're leaving home. Frodo even sells his house. And when the story gets all the members of the fellowship, all of them have left home
Right.
to come to Rivendell.
Hmm.
Refusal of call. We see this in most of the fellowship. For Boromir, he wants to take the ring back home and not to have it destroyed.
Hmm.
So he's refusing the call to go destroy it. For other members of the fellowship, while we don't read any actual refusal, but when we read between the lines, there's hesitation.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you watch the movie, you can even see where the characters, look like
They're hesitating.
they're hesitating, but they know this is the right thing to do.
They act the pants off themselves.
Uh,
I don't know what that phrase was, but
yeah.
it accurately describes my feelings in this moment.
Oh, okay.
They just
Act the pants off. Okay.
they acted their pants off.
So then we get to the mentor or the supernatural power.
Hmm.
Um, all of them see Gandalf as this being their role. But
Hmm.
later on, Gandalf gets traded off for someone else, basically for most of them.
Yeah.
Like for Merry and Pippin, it becomes Treebeard,
Hmm.
uh, and so forth. Uh, for Legolas and Gimli, it's each other
Yeah.
because they're learning from each other.
Hmm.
Uh, Now, here we see everyone in the fellowship crossing the threshold into the unknown.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
for sure.
and
You see the Mines of Moria. You see
what that's what I was going. Yeah, because
Lothlorien.
and this threshold into the unknown is the beginning of transformation.
And again, we were talking off mic how even Gandalf goes through some of these things. Oh, are you about to say that? Yeah, go.
Uh,
Sorry.
so Gimli and Legolas. So one of the thresholds is Gimli and Legolas accept each other as being equals.
Yes.
Okay. We also have the actual crossing of a threshold into Moria.
Right.
The crossing into Moria cements the fact that they are all allies as well.
Hmm.
Um, they will face their first wave of enemies together.
Yeah.
Now, previously, Gandalf, as I said, was the mentor of the supernatural power for everyone but himself. And it is in his fall into the abyss um,
With the Balrog.
well, yeah, with the Balrog, that he comes upon a supernatural power. We hear him tell about it. We don't actually read about it,
Hmm.
but it's because of that power that he survives that fall to the center of the earth, basically.
Spoilers.
And it's not a spoiler. If they've been reading the book along with us, they should be there. If they're listening to this,
Fuck.
oh, so
Are you off? Shush.
it is because of that power that he survives the fall. And that power changes him from the gray wizard into the white.
Hmm.
Now, with the fall of Gandalf, they have all truly entered the ordeal now. And even Gandalf is having his ordeal, which we do not know
Hmm.
about until he reappears as the White Wizard. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli go into the direction they need to go.
Hmm.
Merry and Pippin are taken into another direction to face their own ordeal.
Hmm.
Sam and Frodo also leave the rest of the party towards their own ordeal. Now, Boromir is kind of interesting. So Boromir realizes as he's trying to take the ring that he is wrong
Yes.
and he has a turn of heart.
He realizes it, and that's why I will argue for liking Boromir. I know he's probably not that popular for people that just kind of read it flat, but I feel like in his last, like those last moments, you see his regret. You see him actively change. You see him trying to make amends.
Right. So, like I said, he defends Merry and Pippin.
Hmm.
We can argue, as I said, that Boromir goes through all of stages really quickly here.
Hmm.
He even symbolically returns home through his horn being found and brought to his father.
Yeah.
So, and then within that ordeal, they all grow or realize that they have skills that they've never used or they've received new skills.
Hmm.
Pippin and Merry physically grow.
They physically grow, they mature.
Yeah. Um, and then all of them go through
Absolute
some type
perfection.
of death and rebirth.
Yes.
Gandalf is easy to figure out.
Hmm.
It's also known as resurrection and atonement.
Hmm.
So Sam and Frodo in Mordor,
Hmm.
Merry and Pippin being taken by the orcs,
Hmm.
Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas go into the land of the dead
Hmm.
and leave alive.
Yeah.
And then they end up receiving the rewards and either find home or return home. But getting home is not really the end.
Right.
Uh, the hobbits have to defend their homeland.
Hmm.
Aragorn now has a kingdom to rebuild.
Hmm.
Legolas and Gimli technically become family.
Yeah, they become family, and they also just they help each other rebuild their own
Right.
peoples.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they teach each other because
Yeah.
they go. Gimli wants them to go here, and then Legolas wants them to go there afterwards, and
Hmm.
stuff like that.
Yeah, it's mentioned in the appendices that we just talked about that in the last episode that their friendship is regarded as one of the most important friendship in by modern literary scholars in the Lord of the Rings, because if it weren't for their friendship, like the rebuilding of Middle Earth would not have been as successful.
And then, of course, Gandalf and Frodo go into the Grey Havens.
And then Sam many years later.
Well, yes, but I'm talking about in the book, not in the appendices, because most people don't read the appendices. I don't know when the first time I read the appendices, but it wasn't within the first couple of times I read the book.
I probably would have never read the appendices, but I'm so glad we did because there's so much more information and it's interesting.
Why are you so sing-songy all of a sudden?
I'm tired and I've been prepping for this and I've been prepping for us starting to record The Hobbit.
So yeah, so that's about the hero's journey.
And that's why we were talking about it here, because it is the start of those distinctive features that we have, and we can see that in other fantasy stories.
Well, George Lucas was aware of this,
Mm-hmm.
and he made
Oh yeah, Star Wars
and
for
he
sure.
made sure that the first movie kind of followed that pattern.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, there are some film schools that teach that, and when I say Act One, Act Two, Act 3,
Mm-hmm. Like it truly is.
it truly is. I mean, that's how they converted it.
Yeah. So, continuing on with that, some of the distinctive features that we see in Tolkien's work and The Lord of the Rings that I mean, did just completely like we have so many examples that we can talk about with them. The first is just truly the epic feel of the story. And that's in terms of a large cast of heroic characters, an epic setting, and epic battles. There are multiple of all of those. And that's exactly what we're talking about with the hero's journey is we have a large cast of characters going through that journey. And the book just has this huge epic feel to it, which has
But yet
inspired so many other epics that we have
and
now.
yet it doesn't. It's not epic in how you see epic now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you think of epic movies,
Right.
you think of Lawrence of Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
You think of those cast of thousands movies.
Right.
And
you even see it in how it's influenced film with Lord of the Rings films, where for for almost 10 years it had the record for the most extras ever in a scene. So, and then yeah, it's incredible like that. And then we have um I'm so mad. Apparently, I forgot to write the last name of this person. Her name is Diana. And so I'm going to have to go back and find that. But she wrote in myth lore that creating a mythology unique to the world that you're writing in, the fantasy, that Tolkien basically founded that literary tradition where, again, it was seen in other stuff, but it was not done to the extent that Tolkien did.
Right.
Where Tolkien literally was writing this Elvish language. He literally had this background information, like mythology on this language, and then decided to incorporate it into the story that he was also thinking about.
He drew his own maps. He drew what he thought certain characters looked like. When we get to the Hobbit, the map, he actually drew the map.
Right. And we get, and that goes again with the epic feel of that story,
Right.
where there's because the thing is with the mythology, there are Tolkien scholars. There are people who have dedicated their lives to studying the mythology of Tolkien's works.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Also,
Because that's what I'm so sorry to cut you off, but that's like what I meant at the beginning, where I would love to hear Tolkien's take on this, because his part of his intentions of Lord of the Ring was to create some sort of mythology for England, and to see that this has happened, I would just love to see his take on it.
Right, yeah, because since that's the type of stuff he read about in other cultures
and he set out to do it, and seeing
and also it was also incorporating England of his time,
Right.
because he had the Middle English and the Old English stories.
Yes.
But that's why we have the hobbits, who are, you know,
Kind of more present day.
well, the more present day.
Which we're going to talk a lot about at the beginning of our Hobbits.
Yes, and they're also, and they also are, they're agricultural. They grow their own food.
Mm-hmm.
They produce their own own entertainment. They produce their own type of entertainment,
Mm-hmm.
which is more like the type of entertainment that the people of the time that Tolkien was writing this.
Right.
Dinner parties and
Mm-hmm.
stories and reading books and playing games.
Yeah.
Type of thing.
And that's something that we also have is, again, it was seen before, but he really, the use of multiple races, of dwarves and elves and hobbits. But not only that, but we also have those sentient, like orcs and goblins and even the spiders, which we'll talk about in a second. He also really popularized powerful talismans, such as swords having names and a history, wizard staffs, obviously some magic rings, and other powerful talismans.
Right. And the other thing I find interesting is, as a dungeon master, as a game master, if you want to write your own campaign, the hero's journey, if you follow that,
that's the best way to do it. Yeah.
do the best way. Or, as I have tried to do, I've done it. I don't think it came out as well as I wanted to. I purposely tried to be anti hero's journey. I didn't want to follow the blueprint. And man, that was hard. And then once, I'm like, okay, I came up with this great idea. And then after the 4 or 5 sessions that we played, I'm like,
this isn't that fun.
No. It's like, well, on its own, it fell into,
got you.
Following
it.
So, but there's so many great things about his books, his literature, the way he writes. And a lot of that is because of his mind.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I've mentioned it before, but he was one of the editors of the Jerusalem Bible, which was the European English translation of the Roman Catholic Bible. And he particularly did Job, but he was kind of an editor over
a bunch
large parts of it.
Yeah.
And so inventing his own languages was just playing around for him.
I mean, we talked about this in one of our bonus episodes where he created his first language at the age of 10, just playing around with his cousins. Is like
cousins and brother,
just for funsies, and that's just what he did. Like that was his hobby, which is great.
Which is what's really funny now that you mention that. Jeff and I, we invented our own language even before we knew anything about this. It was a way for us to talk to each other without mom and dad knowing what we were talking about.
So just slang.
No. Well,
no,
it wasn't slang. It was literally things like jinka patinka or
interesting.
Things like that. It was almost like the languages twins come up with. And I think that's why we did it. I think we had read something about twins doing that.
Got you.
And that's why we did it.
No, Alex and I just got really good at Pig Latin, and we were able to talk Pig Latin so fast that you and Mom weren't able to keep up.
I didn't care.
That too. But yeah, Alex and I, we just got really good at Pig Latin.
I hate the name. It's neither pig nor Latin. Don't call it Pig Latin. Call it something else.
That's in snaps. Snaps.
It took me forever to figure out snaps, but when I figured it out, I went,
I know. As It took forever to get it, but once you know it, it's fun to just like do that. Um, but yeah, so I was not good at creating languages, but I enjoyed silly ones. But then,
but and also Gandalf is such a huge influence on so many things.
oh yeah,
One of the back in the 79 to 82, 83 era, down in the North Carolina Outer Banks. I can't remember if it was actually in Kill Devil Hills or in Nag's Head, but on Beach Road, there was a restaurant called Gandalf's. And they had like this 12-foot high hand painted sign of what whoever painted it thought Gandalf looked like.
interesting.
That is the image that is in my mind today still.
Okay,
Because, well, one, it was done well. But
right.
two, it was the first time I actually
Like
saw
saw it.
somebody else
Yeah.
put it, out there as art.
And then, of course, another big theme that he really dived into is the themes of life, death, immortality, good and evil, but how it comes to be. Like, he doesn't just go into those themes, but he talks about how good comes about, how evil comes about. He gets really in depth about like Gollum. Like we have Gandalf as the proxy saying that Gollum still might be able to choose to be good kind of thing. Which like was Gollum like yes, Gollum had like that's the one that I automatically think of is Gollum did have more greed than probably the average pre-Hobbit. Um but it wasn't until the ring kind of capitalized on it and made those the worst impulses the like what you just obsess over really, and it talks about that where it's like good is good and evil is evil, but why? And that's something that you see in Harry Potter as well as the Song of Ice and Fire, where they were heavily influenced by those themes in particular. How you feel about how they executed them, different story, but there is no denying that those two works are now very influential pieces of work in the 21st century now. Um, and then just a couple other interesting things with it is so you have all of those themes, and then we talked about it a little bit when we had Shelob, but giant spiders. Giant spiders was an unintended consequence that is just it's just the one thing that I pick out that you see a lot in fantasy stuff because of the Shelob and those giant spiders in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit,
But see, I
where
think
it's
that's actually part of that
but
mentality driven into us. We're taught to be afraid of spiders. We're taught to be afraid of snakes.
well that's the
I
thing
mean,
like
there's even justification of why we don't like snakes in the book of Genesis.
well, what I was
Um,
talking about with spiders is so first of all, we've talked about the story before on the podcast how in South Africa as a small boy he was bitten by a tarantula. Now Tolkien claims that that had no influence at all on his writing. However,
well, he says he didn't even remember it until somebody brought it up later on,
right, exactly. However, we do
which means
have
it did have a influence on
and,
him
yeah,
because
and
he
he
has mentally blocked it out.
right, because we have him writing in some letters that he doesn't that he's the type of person that he sees a spider inside and he's going to shoo it outside. But in other letters, he admits that he has an irrational fear of spiders and he wishes he didn't. And
Irrational.
yeah,
Irrational.
irrational, that's how I pronounce it. Anyway, and so either way, giant spiders became just a huge part of fantasy. We see it in, of course, in Harry Potter with Aragog. We see a big like D&D demon queen is Lolith, the demon spider queen of spiders and drowls. And we even have it
How
in
would you
Stephen
pronounce the name?
King's The Mist, The Grey Widower. What?
How did you pronounce the name of the god?
Lolth?
Okay.
Did I probably said it
No, that
the
no.
wrong way? Or
Yeah.
I probably said it differently earlier, but yeah, it should be Lolth. Um, but I just think that that's a very interesting, like, unintended consequence of of like his works, where we see giant spiders all the time. And it's a great metaphor. And then a random thing that I like is that we do have a lot of works that are supposed to be extensions or sequels to Lord of the Rings, and apparently there was a loophole in Russian copyright law back in the day where some authors just straight up published works based in Tolkien's world.
It wasn't a loophole. It was ignored everyone's copyright except their own.
That's the loophole.
Mm.
And but yeah, they call it a loophole in the source that I found. But yeah, there's even a story called The Ring of Dark, which is set after the events of Lord of the Rings, directly in that world. And then something that I found very interesting, and I wanted to surprise you with this fact and get your opinion on it. So, just like all works, fans get inspired. And back in 2014, it was estimated that 10% of all fan fiction that is found online is related to Tolkien in some way, whether it's directly about Tolkien's works or about works that were directly inspired by Tolkien. Now, something that is becoming more and more common is published authors, especially in the fantasy genre, got their work as fan fiction authors. That's where they started doing their, like, developing their skills and coming up with their own ideas before they transferred into completely original ideas. And the example that I wanted to take is the Mortal Instruments series, which I'm not a big fan of the books, but I loved the Shadowhunters TV series that was based off of it. But the Mortal Instruments, the author started what became the Mortal Instruments as a Harry Potter fan fiction that in turn was directly influenced by Tolkien. And Mortal Instruments, even though it's not my particular cup of tea, I know so many people that love it. It's a very popular book series, and the author is an amazing author. She does write very well. And like I said, I like what the TV show Shadowhunters did. So I just think that that's a really cool example of like what this is.
Right.
What do you think about that fact? About how that's happening? Because I think it's fascinating that
But you know what I'm surprised by? It's only 10%.
That's fair. That is an interesting point. And remember, it's only directly influenced
Well, that's what
by
I mean, though.
Tolkien.
That's what I mean, though.
I mean, there's other influences that there probably could be stuff with lesser Tolkien influences.
I think that is that based on what the writers said influenced them, or is that what people think influenced them? Because that makes a difference.
Yeah. So the way that it was quantified is it so it was taken from the 10 most popular and fan fiction online sites such as Archive of Our Own, fanfic.net, Wattpad, etc. And the stories that the fan fiction was based off of, that in turn those authors have directly said or mentioned Tolkien as an influence. Because of course there's so many other works where we can infer that Tolkien had some sort of influence on them, whether consciously or not. But yes, that's how it was quantified, was works that have been directly influenced by Tolkien, and that is quantified by the authors themselves saying that.
Right. So
there probably is so much more.
But see, as you know, I have a love-hate relationship with fan fiction. Most of it, I don't like. Most of it, I think it's writers being lazy. I mean, I can see it as an exercise to get your juices flowing,
It's
or to write a short story that's you share with your friends, or
Mhm.
that's funny, or has a weird take on it. But just to write a book length manuscript about a work of fiction, a fictional world that you know,
See, it's definitely a different conversation that we're definitely going to have at some point, but it probably isn't. That is kind of like this, but we'll definitely have to like go into it later. But I think that there's definitely a generational shift of the perception of fan fiction and just a generational shift of how fan fiction is done. And it's something that I actually talk about in the comic book world, where I actually am considered a fanfic historian, where I actually do panels at comic conventions about the history of fan fiction and its subsequent influence on fandom and culture. So maybe I'll do a bonus episode where I talk a little bit about that. But it is something where you see that the first I oh my gosh, I can't remember where I found this, but I believe the first known written fan fiction of The Lord of the Rings was in 1959, I believe. I'm gonna have to check that stat, but I remember seeing that, and that how fan fiction is done, how it's used, has definitely dramatically changed over the years. I mentioned in one bonus episode that the first widely accepted fan fiction was actually written by Alexander the Great, who wrote a fan fiction basically reimagining himself and his best friend as um, Achilles and Patroclus, which take from that what you will, but yeah, I just trying to keep it as short as possible. Fan fiction is definitely a very controversial subject, a very diverse subject. It there's a lot of discussion in the literary world about just so many different things involving fan
yeah.
fiction. So maybe I'll talk about that at some point on a bonus episode, because Tolkien works are a great example of that. There are a lot for Tolkien works, especially the trope of having someone who read the books is suddenly in the books is a very common fanfic trope that we see directly in the Tolkien works in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
Lazy.
So, not necessarily lazy, more of a wish fulfillment type thing.
So, right.
It's
I can, so
it's
I can, I mean,
there definitely can be lazy writing, and I can understand where you're coming from with that, but a lot of times, at least in my generation, it's I wish I was in Lord of the Rings and I was this heroine that is with one of the characters. Like, it's just someone who wants to romantically be with one of the characters in their works, and it's a rewriting of, say, the Lord of the Rings. Like, what would have happened if I went in knowing what I know and I'm with them? Like, what could I have changed? And it's not necessarily lazy, it's more like a wish fulfillment type thing, in my opinion.
right. I mean, there's one thing to pretend as a kid, pretend you're Obi-Wan and da da da, you know, and because that is a kind of fan fiction, where you're pretending to be
Right.
them and you're writing your
It's more
own.
of the imagining yourself in it versus actually writing it down and putting it out there for other people to read and see.
Right.
And I mean, again, like I said, it's definitely a generational thing. I can understand where you're coming from, but it is definitely too much of a topic to get into at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to say my one last thing.
Okay.
I want to read original stuff. I want to read stuff that came from your mind. I don't want to read your reimagining of. something I already love.
That's completely your prerogative. I'm going to do a shout out to one of my favorite podcasts, Fanatical Fix and Where to Find Them, where it's a podcast purely on early Harry Potter fan fiction. And the group of friends that I know, Dad just had a full body shiver. And yeah, that's exactly exactly the correct reaction. But the friends that I have made in the club and group that is formed around this podcast, which is, again, the podcast itself is amazing, where we're celebrating. Instead, it's not making fun of these writings. It's celebrating the fact that we all, as very young preteens and teens, thought that we were the greatest writers ever. Because I admit I wrote fan fiction. I still write it as an adult, but more mature, and or going for completely silly nonsense just for the sake of nonsense. And it's celebrating, it's like, this is where we were mentally, this is how we processed our feelings and our artistic endeavors. And it's from us writing such terrible, terrible things, we were able to get feedback and actually make ourselves better writers. And I know some people who, again, kind of like hone their writing skills from doing fun fan fiction to having complete other ideas of their own, that now they're better writers for the feedback that they got. So, but yeah, you're right. It's some people, they just want to read original stuff. Other people, there's comfort in finding more stories based in this world they love.
Right. Well,
So there's so much to it.
right, and also
As a self-proclaimed fan fiction historian, um as my friends have now been starting to call me too, and again, I do panels on at comic cons about it. um it's such a crazy wild world out there for it.
right. So I would much rather read somebody who's come up with their own system for magic
Hmm.
than to um, talk about another magical world.
Hmm. Well, yeah, absolutely. I love that too. But sometimes but that's what we see a lot, is the writers are learning how to actually physically write and
Right.
properly write through fan fiction. And then they do develop their own magic system and their own stories within that magic system and go on to become writers.
Yeah.
I have two friends at the moment who are currently doing that.
And now
they are fine tuning their own magic system.
and now with that said, you know, playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, you are using someone else's,
Yeah.
and even if you're creating your own spells, you're still using
The magic system that's already been
their
created. Yeah.
matrix of it. Um, so, I mean, like, speaking of Matrix, that's one reason why that movie was so amazing, because it was just a very new thought, and they
Yeah.
did it well.
And that's something that we definitely have talked about in our own conversations about criticism of current movies, where we see a lot of movies that are just kind of remakes or sequels to stuff. And unfortunately, very original ideas aren't, I would say that studios aren't as willing to take a chance on, because it's not proven that it can do really well, versus the stuff that is tried and true. But that's where we're coming into the whole problem, where we're getting superhero fatigue now, and that's a whole nother story.
Right. And it's the joke. There are only three types of movies:
Oh yeah.
boy meets girl, boy saves world, Messiah story,
Yeah.
which is technically a boy saved world.
Yeah.
um,
Save the world. Save the cheerleader, save the world.
so anyway, I've been Robert,
And I've been Evelyn.
and this is Token About It for what it's worth.